Good afternoon. My name is Chip Gibbons. I'm the Policy Director of Defending Rights in Dissent. It's 3 o'clock here on the East Coast, where I'm in Washington, D.C. It's 12 o'clock noon on the West Coast. And of course, it's other times in other time zones. But most importantly, it's time for a discussion of the bipartisan outrage of Espionage Act abuse. Today, I'm joined by Jesselyn Radack, who heads the Whistleblower and Source Protection Program WHISPER at ExposeFacts. As a whistleblower defense attorney, her clients have included Daniel Hale, whose case we'll be discussing today, Edward Snowden, Thomas Drake, who's on the panel with us. And in addition to being an advocate for whistleblowers, Jesselyn herself was actually a Department of Justice employee who disclosed ethics violations during the FBI's interrogation of John Walker Lind. Thomas Drake also joins us. Tom is an NSA whistleblower. As a senior NSA executive, he tried to alert his superiors, Congress, and the NSA and the Department of Defense Inspector Generals to waste and abuse concerning the NSA Stellar Wind program. When this failed, he gave non-classified information to the Baltimore Sun. The U.S. government retaliated by charging Tom under the Espionage Act, but they would eventually drop the Espionage Act charges against him as their case unraveled. We're also joined today by Jeffrey Sterling. I believe this is his first time on one of our Defending Rights in Dissent broadcasts, but hopefully he'll join us again. Jeffrey was a CIA whistleblower who was charged and wrongfully convicted under the Espionage Act. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. It's a really all-star panel. I wish it was under better circumstances. For people who are tuning in, the reason why we're all here today is to discuss the case of Daniel Hale. Daniel Hale was an Air Force veteran and intelligence analyst who last week pled guilty to one count under the Espionage Act of giving information to a reporter. It's believed that reporter was Jeremy Scahill, and that information is the so-called drone papers. If you haven't read the drone papers, what they showed were a number of shocking revelations about the U.S. drone program, including how the kill chain, the bureaucratic process by which targets for assassinations are selected. It showed how intelligence analysts culled through tons of information in the terror watch list and then developed these baseball cards, which were eventually given to the president to basically decide whether or not he wanted to carry out a summary execution or not. While these programs are called targeted killings, the revelations in the drone paper showed they were anything but targeted. During one 5-month period, 90% of those killed by U.S. airstrikes were not the intended target. Even when the U.S. government killed unintended targets, it would classify them as enemies killed in action unless after their death, this is very Kafkaesque and perverse, evidence could be gathered that showed they were not an enemy. So that's the type of situation we're in. I would also point out that in the early 2000s, when the Israeli government began a policy of targeted killings, the then Bush administration criticized those actions as illegal under international law. The Obama administration, when trying to legally justify its own program of targeted killings, actually cited the actions of the Israeli government the past administration had said were illegal. So these are revelations about a shocking human rights abuses at the very least. This is something that we as a society should have a right to discuss democratically about whether or not we want this to be the policy of our government. Unfortunately, from the Pentagon papers to the drone papers, the U.S. government has sought to classify and keep secret the realities of its war making in order to prevent that sort of democratic discussion. Jesselyn, you are one of Hale's attorneys. What's your reaction to this case in general and the course that it's taken?
This case has been crazy because of the longevity. It has spanned 3 different presidential administrations. We had Trump, we had Obama, we had Trump, and now Biden. I am appalled at this case because basically Daniel's crime was providing truthful information to the press that was clearly a matter of public interest, and numerous documentaries and news articles and series and books were published with the information, based on the information that Daniel Hale provided. Clearly, it was in the public interest, but unfortunately, there is no public interest defense to the Espionage Act. So I feel like Daniel is being made an example of, the way they did with Jeff Sterling and John Kiriakou and Stephen Kim and Chelsea Manning and so many other whistleblowers, Reality Winner, who's currently in prison right now, because people revealed information that was embarrassing to the US government, or in Daniel's case, exposed human rights abuses and war crimes.
Tom, what's your reaction to the Daniel Hale case as a former Espionage Act defendant and whistleblower yourself?
Well, it's surreal. I mean, I was a signature Espionage Act case under Obama, and the first whistleblower charged under the Espionage Act since Daniel Ellsberg of Pentagon Papers fame. Daniel Hale is now the signature Espionage Act case under Biden. It's very disturbing that the Espionage Act, which is really a World War I era statute, that was designed to go after dissent, those who would, quote unquote, share non-national defense information with someone not authorized to receive it, starting with Ellsberg, but then resurrected under Obama, and increasingly so as the Obama administration went on, even into its second administration, and then of course under Trump, and now under Biden. We see what I can only say a continuum of the use and abuse of the Espionage Act to silence dissent, to silence those who dare speak truth to power, those who would dare cross swords, as it were, or simply cross the vanguards of national security and those who protect it. And it's a severe punishment. I mean, it's about as severe a charge that can be levied against you. I'm only fortunate, extraordinarily rare case. I, like Ellsberg, although Ellsberg went to trial, I did not end up in prison. It's extraordinarily difficult to defend yourself. You are literally assumed guilty by virtue of being charged. You cannot defend yourself in terms of motive. Even public interest is off the books. So there's all these restrictions, and the punishment, which is extraordinary in terms of the number of years. I was facing 35 years myself under the original 10 count, of which 5 were under the Espionage Act. So your life is completely turned inside out and upside down. And this has become, unfortunately and tragically, the go-to. And the huge elephant in the room, though, gigantic elephant in the room, is that it's ultimately pointing it's weaponizing the disclosures of information that the government simply does not want the public to see, but it's weaponizing in a way that it's now directly targeting and implicating, as it did in my own case and all the other cases that have followed. Guess what? Journalism, press, publishers.
And there was a former top lawyer for the NSA, I'm blanking on his name, who has publicly commented in the Hale case that he thinks they should have charged the journalist as well, explicitly citing the Assange precedent. So, I mean, that's where we are at in this moment in history, which is a really very dark moment. Jeffrey, what's your reactions? Like Tom, you yourself have faced charges under the Espionage Act.
I think once again, it's a bullying move by the government, the U.S. government administrations, to quiet dissent and to quash any sort of revelations of wrongdoing in this particular case by the military. And it is, as Tom said, it is the go-to tool for them to use, because the deck is stacked so much in the government's favor when they use the Espionage Act. I mean, forget about the fact that, we're not talking about espionage here. The individuals charged with espionage are not spies. Yet the Department of Justice is free to use this in any instance that it wants to. And I would say in every instance that it's been used has been a situation where information was released or revelations came forward that the government did not want to come forward or was embarrassed by it. And it's unfortunate that the courts are assisting in, as Tom said, weaponizing the Espionage Act. And I say it's just sad. And to hear see that Hale pled guilty last week, and my heart sank. I was there in that situation with, in the same sort of situation. And, to excuse my French, it's one of those where you kind of have to say the bastards won again.
Yeah, my heart also sank as well when I heard the news. This morning I was going through some of the motions that the prosecution and the defense had filed. And one of the things the defense brought up was that this was a selective prosecution, right? In official Washington, government officials leak information all the time. They give information that's, national defense information about the drone program to the media all the time with the intent of, having some gullible journalist publish a bunch of positive things about the drone program, how effective it is, how great it is. Hale's crime, and I, use that word in quotations, was not that he gave quote unquote national defense information to a journalist, but he did so really exposing the government as liars, right? They're sitting there saying they're doing targeted killings, and 90% of the people they're killing are not the intended target. Jesselyn, what do we make of the way the government uses the Espionage Act?
The Espionage Act has been used against the darkest secrets that our country has engaged in this century. So if you look at the people who've been prosecuted under the Espionage Act, it's been people who exposed the NSA's warrantless wiretapping program, which later was found to be illegal and unconstitutional, people who divulged torture, and people who exposed the drone program where innocent civilians were being swept up, and those numbers were not being reported or severely undercounted. We were talking about the pinpoint precision of drones, and how this was like the new, we could avoid having to have boots on the ground because of these great drones, and it was totally overselling a very dark program, a wet ops program, a problematic program, and just, think of all the amazing movies that have been made glamorizing drones, TV shows and movies. And the people cooperating with those movies are people like Petraeus and Brennan and people who have been involved at very high levels. But do they ever get accused of revealing classified information? Petraeus was accused of that once, and he took a sweetheart plea deal, and he had given black book information to his mistress, who was a journalist, and he got a little slap on the wrist. So the way that regular employees, mere mortals, are treated, it's just sent the most chilling of messages. And in fact, this case is a product of what Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, said, we want to be tough on leaks. Trump doesn't like leaks, and therefore we're going to dust off all of these old cases and we're going to go forward with them. I thought this case was dead on the vine, but now here we are.
It took him 5 years to bring the indictment, and I was watching last night your scene in National Bird, Jesselyn, where you mentioned that he has this charge hanging against him for a long time. They could bring it back at any moment. I don't think you quite meant they could bring it back 5 years, but it's chilling knowing what happens to watch your interview in that movie. Tom, what do you think is the impact of the Espionage Act on our ability as a democracy to decide whether or not our government is sort of acting in our best interest or doing things that we don't like, right? We've seen the government gets away with, in the case of some NSA officials, perjuring themselves of what they're doing. they get away with leaking information when it is to their advantage. But then when anyone puts truthful information out, or information that paints their programs in a negative light, we bring Espionage Act charges against them. What's the impact of this double standard on our democracy?
Oh, it's breaking. I mean, you could easily argue that those of us who have disclosed in the public interest in various forms based on secret programs and government wrongdoing and war crimes of various kinds, as well as other disclosures that are truly in the public interest, that the government doesn't want to know. The impact in this case is you're actually shutting down and considering First Amendment activities to be criminal. I mean, all of us who've been charged in the Espionage Act as non-spies, starting with Ellsberg, are charged on the espionage, quote unquote, charged with espionage for having committed the truth about what the government is actually doing, quote unquote, in the public's name. But here's the kicker. The kicker is that somehow the government has found itself over the decades, and increasingly post 9/11 in particular, that it is exempt from all the normal guardrails that not only protect what we refer to as our special democracy, which is a constitutional republic, but the guardrails that are supposed to ensure that we have insight into what the government is doing in our name. And if it's doing something that is outside of the purview of what is legal and lawful or violates the Constitution, then people should be held accountable. But the pyramid has been flipped. So the government wants to protect its secrets from the public. But if you dare expose those secrets, then you're now a criminal. So in essence, any revelation about crimes committed by the state is now considered a crime against the state, and we will punish you accordingly. That's really what the message is, and I think it should be an extraordinarily timely reminder. Once again, with the Daniel Hale case, it should be a really wake up call. And I have been saying this now, right? Hollering is a whistleblower from the wilderness, and even with the publicity that was created, not just during my case, but in the wake of my case, and then obviously later when it really ramped up with the Snowden disclosures, which was just the full metastasization of the mass surveillance regime, not just the United States, but worldwide. That this really is a direct reflection of what I have called the de-evolution of democracy. That the degree to which the government is increasingly using force, increasingly using abuse of power, and increasingly willing to attempt to snuff out and suppress the truth about its own activities is an indication about whether or not the democracy that we are supposed to live under is actually healthy. I would argue that it's not, that we're actually have been increasingly entering, in terms of history, darker and darker chapters as this has moved forward. And a lot of people, well, hey, you had non-disclosure agreements. This is classified. Well, this idea that something is classified or is supposedly classified, or the government claims it is classified, is kind of this bright red line. And if you cross it, well, guess what? We're going to sacrifice you on the altar of national security. And we're the ones, you're seeing, looking at myself, even what Jesselyn herself went through in terms of threats to her. And of course, she ended up losing her job. What happened to Jeffrey, and I'll let him speak for himself, of course, what happened to me, but we're still this rather small group that is part of it, but we're just a reflection of the larger dynamic. And it is supposed to and intended to send an extraordinarily chilling message. But remember, the government leaks all the time. The biggest leaker is the government. But if it's authorized, and I put that in quote, then your chances of getting crossovers of the government are slim to none, or you'll get some kind of sweetheart deal, or basically a slap on the wrist, and you'll go your merry way. But if you're someone like us, and I say us, those who are disclosing thing in the public interest, well, we're going to take the full force of the law and just hammer you as hard as we can.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up the classification angle because, I mean, before the Hale defense could even make the argument, the prosecution in a pretrial motion asked the judge to bar the defense from bringing up misclassification in the government or challenging any of the classifications of the documents. In their briefs, which the judge accepted, they made a number of shocking arguments, which is first and foremost, classification is the sole function of the executive branch. Therefore, neither the judge nor the defense can challenge a classification decision, which is pretty much makes judicial review irrelevant in this context. And also that it's not an element of the Espionage Act that the information was properly classified or not, right? They actually say in the brief, the Espionage Act does not require the information to be classified properly, just classified. So even if the information isn't properly classified, doesn't matter, you're guilty. And
none of it matters.
None of it matters. None of it matters. No, you're guilty.
The word classification did not even enter the lexicon. It wasn't even created until the 1950s. I mean, long decades after the Espionage Act. So now it doesn't even matter whether it was classified or not. First of all, there's a huge problem with overclassification that even the government has acknowledged. But second of all, it doesn't even matter. Tom was prosecuted even though they were using clearly unclassified information. But part of the problem is because of the way the Espionage Act is written, you can be prosecuted for revealing national defense information. And that is such a broad category, especially now that we are such a national security state. Almost anything can be national defense information. I mean, the seating chart for a presidential event can be classified as national defense information. I mean, I've seen baby announcements stamped classified. I mean, the
sex of the dog that Donald Trump used in the raid was classified.
Exactly. So
big secret.
Overbroad.
Yeah.
I think another aspect of it is classification. The way the government is able to use it, they can have it both ways. Yeah. And it's just underpins how the Espionage Act is being utilized for retaliation. In my case, I sued the CIA for racial discrimination. Old story with me, they said I was too big and black to serve as a case officer. I sued them in federal court, yet the government was able to argue that should this trial go forward in a public forum, it would pose a threat to national security. Well, they turn around years and years later, accusing me of leaking classified information and go about the exact same trial that I would have had I been able to go forward with my discrimination case. And yet their trial against me revealed far more classified information than I ever would have. So the government is able to get it both ways with classification and the Espionage Act. They can use it to quiet dissent, and they can also use it and then also turn around and use it to punish dissent. So, and talk about national defense. They don't really have to define or specify what part of national defense is being endangered or what damage was caused by. They don't have to prove, they don't have to establish any of that information. So as a defendant going up against the Espionage Act and the entire rubric of classification, it's a very, I will try to say uphill battle, but that's not, I think, sufficient enough to describe the almost impossible task of defending yourself against the Espionage Act.
Yeah, I mean, the longevity of the Espionage Act is just amazing. As Jesselyn pointed out, it predates the classification system. As one of the briefs for Hale's defense pointed out, it predates modern First Amendment jurisprudence, which in a lot of ways our sort of modern, expansive understanding of the First Amendment was a reaction to the abuse of the Espionage Act during World War I, right? The government put all these people on trial, like Eugene Debs, for opposing the war, and they're they said, no, this is the First Amendment. And the judges said, no, you don't know what you're talking about, you silly people. And there was this huge movement of non-lawyers, of non-judges who sort of like said, no, actually, this is free speech. This is what our Constitution, the lawyers are wrong here. And history sort of was on their side. So it's sort of a bizarre dualistic history it has with our understanding of free speech and free press in the modern era. We've talked a bit about how difficult it is to mount a defense under the Espionage Act, and I just want to make the audience aware of some of the motions that the prosecution filed and got away with. They filed a motion saying that the defense could not, this was preemptively, could not mention Hale's good intentions because intentions do not matter. The judge agreed with that. They basically would not have been allowed to mention at all why Hale, looked at this information and made the decision to release it. I mean, in the movie National Bird, he talks about how unsettling it is that when he selects someone for kill or capture, there's just no way of telling if they're a civilian or not. None of that would have made to the jury. Infamously, Daniel Ellsberg takes the stand in his defense during the Pentagon Papers trial. His lawyer asks them, why'd you leak the Pentagon's papers? The judge intercepts, says, no, you can't answer that question. His lawyer says, I've never heard of a case where the defendant could not answer this question. And the judge says to the lawyer, well, now you have. Real great judicial ethics there. There was another motion. He couldn't bring up misclassification, as we brought up. He could not make the claim that everybody leaks or that leaks are routine in Washington. And also, quoting the brief, they want to bar the defense from claiming an alternative perpetrator committed the charged crimes absent some non-speculative evidence of that individual's connection to a particular reporter and knowledge and access of the documents at issue. I don't really know what kind of a defense Hale would have been allowed to present here. Jesselyn, could you tell us a little bit more about how difficult it is to defend oneself under the Espionage Act?
It's nearly impossible. First of all, you're subject to the Classified Information Procedures Act. So you have to go into a specially built SCIF to even review the evidence against you. You can't. Your attorneys can take notes on the voluminous evidence, but you can't take a copy back to the office to go over it. Basically, there are all these weirditudes, like you're not allowed to say certain classified things. So we're going to have a trial, but you have to substitute code words for classified language. So in Tom's case, for example, the word fiber optic, which you hear in every AT&T commercial, but no, the government considers that those two words classified. So we had
fiber optic.
Yeah, fiber optic.
I want to make sure I heard that correctly.
Yes, that is correct. So, I mean, the barriers, the evidence being in secret, the fact that it's this Kafkaesque kind of, I mean, you're supposed to have a free and open trial, but everything is locked down in secrecy. Even when I went to one of Daniel's pretrial hearings, it was on the selective and vindictive prosecution. Even though I was one of the attorneys, they were like, if you don't have a clearance on this particular motion, you can't go in the courtroom. And I worked on the motion. It was nuts.
Shocking.
It's Byzantine. And it's amazing to me that, I mean, people have tried to mount constitutional challenges to the Espionage Act. And basically, it's an unconstitutional law. But years ago, to try to keep it kosher, they grafted on an intent requirement. Like every other criminal statute on the books, your intent matters, right? So they grafted on this intent requirement, but even that doesn't come into play until sentencing. So you're in this very bizarre world. I mean, in Tom's case, you were not allowed to say the word overclassification. You were not allowed to say the word newspaper. These are the word fiber optic. I mean, these are very basic words that would be integral to his defense, and the government was like, no, you can't say these out loud. It's amazing to me that this law is still on the books. I know there are a lot of efforts, including Chip by your organization, to try to reform the Espionage Act or get it repealed. But I feel like it's an uphill battle. I feel like
it is.
These cases should not be brought under the Espionage Act. There are some dozen other laws that can be used for unauthorized disclosures of classified information that could be used, but they use the Espionage Act because it is a 10-year penalty for each count. And with these other laws, it's much more reasonable, 1 year to 2 years. But they use it because it is so draconian and because it does allow the government to go after a minnow with a sledgehammer.
I mean, and I'm glad you mentioned the attempts to reform the Espionage Act, because Defending Rights of Dissent and Whisper worked together after the Assange indictment, the Espionage Act one, to meet with congressional offices and try to educate them on the problems your clients had faced and just the general problems faced under the Espionage Act. And we did get a couple of offices to put some very mild bills forward. But it is such an uphill battle to get anyone on Capitol Hill to care about this issue or be willing to do anything at all. Very few members of, everyone loves Daniel Ellsberg 40 years after the fact, but no one is, or very few people are willing to speak out on behalf of the Daniel Ellsbergs of today, because they're just so, intimidated by the national security state, or this is just considered such a political non-starter. Like the cowardice of Congress and their failure to amend the act cannot be called out and shamed enough here. And the same goes for the courts, who have, the power to stop a lot of this, but have allowed it to go forward, sanctioning some really abusive and expansive attempts or interpretations of the law by the government. Tom, did you have something you wanted to add in there?
The whole thing is surreal. I sit here as a free man, and Jeffrey knows what it means to have been imprisoned and then become free again. And it's incredibly precious. This is what's happening in this country, and we're the canaries in the dark, deep coal mines of democracy, but we're also the ones that are shouting from the wilderness. So it's not just underground, but it's also above ground. That's in the public interest. Look, all of the attempts, everything you've been sharing, right? Because I was the signature case under Obama and the first whistleblowers in Ellsberg charged in the same manner. All of this has thrown me back to the days in which I was indicted, because and then all the pretrial proceedings that went on for about 14 months. All the things that we've been mentioning, right, were all tried in my case. The government wanted to set a precedent of actually getting someone indicted under the Espionage Act, because that's the first step in ultimately indicting a publisher, indicting a journalist, indicting a media outlet. Now we've seen that under Trump, he then proceeded, although Obama and Biden chose not to because of First Amendment issues and freedom of the press, to go after Assange. Trump decided to go after him. That has not stopped under Biden. And so even people who do not like Assange, do not like me, do not like whistleblowers, quote unquote, disclosing national security information, realize there's an even greater threat that is actually at stake here. And that is actually the government is now attempting to establish precedent to actually now implicate the press.
And as mentioned earlier, there is a former NSA lawyer, I think his name is George Crooner,
Yep.
who is running around both in journal articles and
Yep.
on social media, upset that Jeremy Scahill wasn't indicted under the Espionage Act, who wrote an entire article saying, a lot of people think the Assange case could set a precedent to be used against the New York Times and these other publishers. And usually the government will say, no, that's not true. And it says, yes, that is true. And I think that's really good. I think the media is publishing too many things they're not publishing, and they should be browbeaten with the threat of prosecution. So we really are, just straight up crossing.
Well, ask Jeffrey. I asked Chip, ask Jeffrey. Look, they attempted to subpoena. They actually did subpoena James Risen 3 times. He was facing jail time if he refused to testify in Sterling's case.
Absolutely.
And it was only at the last minute that the Obama administration actually blinked. And I know, Jeff, I know you have a fair amount to say about this. This is, so they attempted, in my case, I'll just speak now to my case, they actually attempted, and the judge, it would have happened if the judge had permitted it. They wanted, get this, they wanted to bring in the reporter of record in my case, who I had gone to with unclassified information regarding government wrongdoing, which included the original beginnings of the super secret domestic mass surveillance regime, plus billions in fraud, waste, and abuse, and massive cover-up in terms of 9/11 intelligence failures. They wanted to bring in the reporter. You know why? It was just stunning in terms of government motive. We're going to bring in, or attempt to bring in, the reporter of record because they're the only eyewitness to the crime that you, me, the defendant, committed. The judge, to his credit, said we're not going to go down that deep dark hole, which would be basically putting the First Amendment on trial. But then the government tried during the motions phase to eliminate as relevant or admissible anything regarding my whistleblowing, which was extraordinarily extensive, including being a material witness for multiple government investigations. They tried to eliminate any reference to anything involving the First Amendment or any of the disclosures that were unclassified to the reporter of record. And then they wanted to eliminate any discussion regarding classification. And in fact, they later then alleged that even if what I disclosed wasn't classified, it was protected information and it deserved the exact same protection as if it were classified. So you tell me.
Yeah.
That's shocking. Jeffrey, do you want to talk about Rosen?
Yeah, in my case, the reporter in question, the government, through preliminary hearing after preliminary hearing, argued that without being able to call the reporter, they didn't have a case. So they were really pressing to be able to also go after the reporter. And again, I think that's part of the retaliation, and to serve a message that even if you're not the person who provided the information, if you received it, and the Espionage Act does allow pretty much anyone who touches the information to be prosecuted under it. But then at the last minute, they decided not to call. Now, when I was a law student in law school, I mean, you put on your best case, you put on your evidence. But with the Espionage Act, the government was not compelled to bring, I mean, they said, this is the only witness we have. This is the only tie we have to Sterling's disclosure of information, yet they decided not to call us. So why is there a case? There's a case because under the Espionage Act, you don't really have to prove anything. That's all you have to do is make an act. All the government has to do is make an accusation, and the court is going to follow through with it. In my case, there was absolutely no evidence presented of when, where, how, or why I supposedly disclosed this information to the reporter. Yet none of that mattered. All the government has to do is point a finger, say it's classified, and use the Espionage Act as its hammer. And again, getting back to selective prosecution, I think my case would be a primer on the ignorance and surrounding use of the Espionage Act and just the horror of it. Talking about selective prosecution, going on during my time was the issues with Petraeus. What happened with him? Nothing. Also, General Cartwright, who disclosed, mine was supposedly disclosed information about the Iranian nuclear program and our efforts to thwart it. Well, with Stuxnet, I believe was the name of the program, Cartwright fully disclosed this information to just about every media outlet possible. Yet what happened with him was eventually a presidential pardon. So, and even during my trial, you will see how selective it is. There was a witness on the stand from the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is the only place that I revealed any classified information, which is a place that individuals who work in the intelligence community are allowed and supposedly encouraged to go to the intelligence committees. This individual was called as a witness, and it was revealed during the trial that she had been fired from her job on the Senate Intelligence Committee because she leaked classified information. And oh, by the way, who did she leak that to? The same reporter in question during my trial. So you would wonder, why is there a trial? Why is this going forward? Because the government really doesn't have to do anything. One thing in my case, which may be unique to a lot of it, people ask me, how it's difficult to mount a defense. I say, well, it's really difficult to mount a defense if you really don't know what the case is against you, other than the looming threat of the Espionage Act. What I like to say, and I think it's the absolute truth, during my trial, the only thing the government proved beyond a reasonable doubt was that I was Black, that I didn't look like anyone from the CIA. And that's all they had to do. And also one other aspect, you go to trial in the Eastern District of Virginia, the jury pool is going to be automatically tainted. Everyone on my jury had some sort of tie to someone in the military or someone who would touch upon classified information or had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, things like that. So the pool itself that's going to judge you is tainted in the government's favor because those individuals aren't going to want to show that they're un-American, and they will save the aspect or the idea of their own job by prosecuting someone else. So it's a tremendous uphill battle. It is impossible. In matter of fact, I will say the defense I mounted, we won that case. There was no doubt about it. I think even the prosecutors were surprised and shocked that I was found guilty. So it's just too one-sided for the government. You, as a defendant, you're not only defending against the charges, you're defending against the judge in the Eastern District of Virginia, who always sides with the government, particularly the CIA. You're also pitted against the jury, who is already automatically biased against you. So it is a very difficult proposition, and I can understand, in Mr. Hale's case and others, why individuals would, take a plea. I mean, I was facing, if we go 10 years per count, which is the reality of it, I was facing 100 years in prison. So it's just ridiculous, and the government has this tremendous tool for retaliation, and they're not being called on it. They're not being checked on it. They're able to use it in whatever way they want. It's only a matter of time. I mean, Julian Assange was the pinnacle at this point, but it's only a matter of time before media outlets, individual reporters are, prosecuted under the Espionage Act.
Yeah, no, it's really very surprising. And, I think we were all sort of bantering in the virtual green room before this. And I think, Jesselyn and I both mentioned, right, we're familiar with the facts of these cases. We're familiar with how the Espionage Act works. Yet every time, you hear these facts anew, I mean, it's still shocking. I mean, I know the facts of your case, I know the facts of Tom's case, but just hearing you both speak them out loud, I'm flabbergasted anew. There's just no number of times you can hear this information and not be shocked. And I don't think the general population really understands what's going on here. And I don't think Congress even really understands it. I'm not going to go into specifics of meetings, but when, William from Whisper Works of Jesselyn and I would go in to congressional offices and talk about some of these cases, people who had pretty important positions were pretty shocked by how little it took to indict someone under the. Of course, they weren't willing to act, but they were nonetheless shocked. Jeffrey, what would you say to Daniel Hale or another whistleblower if you could speak to them?
Regardless of the fight that's against you, you stick to your guns, you stick to your convictions. Again, everyone has a different situation, and I can't say that everyone who's facing being charged under the Espionage Act should go to trial or take a plea. I mean, that's an individual decision to make. But regardless, of what decision you make. You stick to your convictions. It takes a lot for someone to come forward with tremendous threat to reveal wrongdoings at the government. And I think those people, whistleblowers, are people who care and have deep concern for this country. You stick with those convictions. You may not be, and people in whistleblower positions don't reveal the information for any sort of reward. They reveal it because of the concern for their country. That is an aspect of accountability to power in this country, and the government using the Espionage Act is whittling it away. But even in the face of such tremendous things, you stick to your convictions. Search your heart, because you did anyway by becoming a whistleblower. Continue doing that, because in the end, they can put you in prison. But you know what? They could not imprison my mind. They could not make me change who I am. Stick to who you are in these sort of situations.
Tom, what would you say to a Daniel Hale or another whistleblower or someone else who is facing what you faced a decade ago?
Yeah, despite the pressure, despite the penalties, despite the fact that he's actually facing prison, but it could have been way, way worse if he had actually gone to trial. That was something I faced. I didn't want to plead out to anything, period. I wanted to face my accusers. I wanted to make that defense, but I knew the deck was stacked against me. And they also had an obstruction of justice charge and lying to the FBI, which were lies and falsehoods in themselves. And so, the courage of your own convictions, because you're in essence one person, who ends up standing up against the vast power of the government, and you're coming out from within. And then you find yourself facing a very, very, very dystopian future. However, history is, and I'll just say this collectively, is on our side. That ultimately, in the long arc of history, it does bend toward justice, and I like to add mercy. It may not look like that when you're facing time in prison. It may not look like that when you're in prison. But I think I'm going to actually completely acknowledge Jeffrey here. The one thing they cannot take away from you is who you are. And by the way, they stripped everything from me that was possible, short of actually ending up in prison. I really had nothing left after they had finished with me over a 4-year period before they indicted me. And then all the accusations, allegations they made, the mischaracterizations, trying to destroy me in terms of my own character, lies and falsehoods and other created evidence to put me into a really, really bad light, quote unquote, because I had dared stand up and speak truth to and about power. In the end, though, the thing that remained, and I'm acknowledging Jeffrey here, is you kept your person. You kept the very essence of who you are as a human being. And one good thing, after I say a good thing, it's kind of surreal for me to say this. The only person that I had that was my voice throughout all of this, until the media finally came around and say, maybe Mr. Drake is a whistleblower, was Jesselyn. As things progressed under Obama and even under Trump and now under Biden, there is this small set of us. We know what it's like to go through this. So, as you know, Jeffrey, there was obviously, even when you weren't in prison, there was means by which communication could take place, right? Yes. While you were temporarily on the inside, that this is not permanent, that it will end, that you will see the light of day. And return to the place we call freedom. And you know, Jeffrey, even more than I do, how extraordinarily precious regaining your freedom is, and what it means to have it taken away in such an abusive and egregious manner by our own government. Look, we all took oaths. This is the kicker. I used to work at the CIA as well. Daniel Hale worked in the military. I was also in the military twice, Air Force and Navy. And then also at the NSA as a top level senior executive. We all took an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, not just foreign, but also domestic. We ended up finding ourselves defending the very Constitution that we had taken an oath to support and defend against our own government. So who's doing the violating here? So if you call out the government violating the Constitution, engage in wrongdoing because it has the power to do so, which is abuse of power, and you become the criminal. I mean, we've lived this, so we know what it means. And we know once freedoms are taken away, once liberties are taken away or eroded, how incredibly difficult it is to recover them or to restore them. So that's why when faced with the prospect, I originally was faced with the prospect of spending the rest of my life in prison. That's what the prosecutor told me. He said, you better start talking now to get into a plea agreement, and maybe you'll only have to serve 20 to 25 years. Isn't that a lot better than the rest of your life? Well, look, I was already in my early 50s. So the prospect of another 20, 25 years in prison versus the rest of my life, it's still pretty much a significant majority of the rest of my life. So, it's understandable, because we're talking about Daniel, that when faced with that prospect, that ultimately he would enter into a plea agreement. And it's certainly not ideal. It's not the best of circumstances. And he's still going to be, in essence, in the hands of the judge come sentencing time.
Tom, Jeffrey, I want to thank both of you for all of your courage and for joining us today and sharing stories about what's probably not the best part of your life. And I want to thank both of you for the solidarity you've shown with Daniel Hale. I mean, even before this program today, you were amongst 73 individuals and 50 organizations who signed a statement circulated by Defending Rights in Dissent, Roots Action, and Whisper in support of Daniel Hale. There was a fairly interesting outpouring of support from whistleblowers, ex-intelligence professionals, and journalists on this statement, which just shows how important Daniel Hale's case is, how Daniel Hale is not alone, and how people understand the importance of what he's done and the importance of recognizing the abuse of what the government is doing. So I just really want to thank both of you for taking your time this afternoon and sharing your stories with us and speaking out on behalf of Daniel Hale. And I admire both of your commitment, both to truth and to standing with other truth tellers. It's very admirable. Jesselyn, I'm not going to ask you what you would say to Daniel Hale since he is your client, and I don't think you're supposed to tell us that sort of thing. So I don't want you to think I'm snubbing you on this question. I'm just respecting attorney-client privilege. But could you tell the audience, we're going to wrap up in a minute, the audience watching or listening, what are the next steps to expect in Hale's case? My understanding is that he's pled guilty to one of the 5 counts against him, but the government has yet to dismiss or drop the remaining 4 counts. What comes next for Dan?
I have never seen this in my 25 years of practicing law, but that's correct. He pled guilty to this 1 count. He is due to be sentenced on July 13th. And if the government doesn't think that the sentence is severe enough, they can reactivate those other 4 counts and continue to press them. That sounds very surreal, but that's the kind of environment you're up against in these Espionage Act cases. So what he faces right now is sentencing, and whether or not the government will be happy with the pound of flesh it's able to exact on that date. So it's very daunting. I would mention that people like Daniel Hale is in his early 30s. Reality Winner is in her mid-20s. She's in prison right now, due to be released in November, also having served the longest sentence ever under the Espionage Act that was a not military sentence. And so it is becoming even worse. I always said the war on whistleblowers is a backdoor war on journalists. And so for all the journalists out there saying, yeah, Julian Assange is not really a journalist or not really a publisher, they need to stop. They need to pay attention, because this is all laying the framework to go after journalists very aggressively under the Espionage Act. And I feel like I've been shouting into the wilderness for a long time about this, but now we're seeing it come to fruition. So I thank you for bringing visibility to to this issue. Daniel's going to need a lot of support. He has a Twitter account. I believe it's at God is a dog.
I think God is a dog. Okay.
And I urge people to support him. Just little messages of support, anything is helpful. Same with whistleblowers like Reality Winner, who are in prison. It is a lifeline, as John Kiriakou and Jeffrey can attest to know that people are watching and they realize what happened to you and they know your struggle.
So Dan's Twitter account is actually God is a cop.
Oh, I'm sorry.
God is a cop. Yes.
Confusing another client.
No. I just double checked because I saw that account. He has some good tweets. Jesselyn, I want to thank you as well. If you're watching at home and you're very disturbed at what's happening to Daniel Hale, I want to urge you to take action. If you visit rightsandDissent.org/online-actions right now, we have an action up asking for leniency for Daniel Hale. Now, obviously, I don't think Daniel Hale should require leniency. I don't think he should have been indicted. I don't think the Espionage Act should exist. But that's not the world we live in at this moment. So we're asking for people to reach out and support leniency for Daniel Hale, who is a conscientious and heroic whistleblower who exposed one of the secretest, darkest abuses of our government. And that is rightsandDissent.org/take action. One word. I'm sorry, I gave the wrong address before. It's rightsandDissent.org/take action. And if you go to that URL right now, you can take an action in support of Hale. I cannot imagine what the people on this panel have lived through. I can say that as someone who lives in this country and believes in the values of the Bill of Rights, it's extremely disturbing and enraging to watch time and time again when good, honest people of conscience expose some of the most serious abuses of power imaginable: illegal surveillance, drone strikes that kill 90% of the targets are the wrong person, the collateral murder video where U.S. gunships killed two journalists, the secret history of the Vietnam War showing the government was lying to the people about its policies. It is just so upsetting to watch again and again the government try to crush brave truth tellers, which is why it's so important we stand in solidarity with them. And I want to thank Jesselyn for all of her work she's done on behalf of whistleblowers. I want to thank her for joining us. I want to thank Tom and Jeff again, both for having the courage to tell the truth and for continuing to stand with and fight on behalf of those who also face the same situations. It is incredibly inspiring to watch. And I want to ask that everyone watching this today have solidarity with Daniel Hale and with all of those who are brave enough to tell the truth about the crimes of our government that are committed in our name, and to go to rightsandDissent.org/take action and speak out for leniency for Daniel Hale. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I wish it was under better circumstances, but I cannot imagine three people I'd rather be talking to this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.